The number of North Koreans seeking refuge in the south has dropped as the country's economy has improved, suggesting a rise in fortune is keeping citizens more content. Joining me down the line is Bradley Babson, a former World Bank official who is now the chair of the DPRK Economic Forum at the US Career Institute at John Hopkins. Bradley, is the reduction of people fleeing south a reflection of lessening economic hardship, would you say?
Probably in general that's true. That's not to say there isn't still a lot of economic distress in the north.
So a brief overview of North Korea's economy. How is it compared to other countries?
Well, it's, I would say, more disconnected from the world economy than any other country in the world. Traditionally, North Korea, like many socialist countries, has emphasized heavy industry and energy-dependent industries, going back to the Soviet era when they were very dependent on oil and energy exports from Russia.
Of course, people often associate North Korea with the nuclear industry. How dependent is their economy on this?
Well, I don't think the economy itself is dependent on the nuclear industry. The nuclear industry doesn't produce value for ordinary North Koreans. What it produces is a certain political value for the leadership to sustain the regime as it has evolved over the decades. It draws resources out of the rest of the economy rather than contributing to the economy.
Well, North Korea is said to be moving towards a market economy. How will this change the country?
It's dramatic, and it's been underway since the mid-1990s when people found that the state distribution system collapsed and it was necessary for people to fend for themselves. Since then, the market economy has grown dramatically, both in terms of the numbers of goods and services available through markets and also the access to markets for most people throughout the country. Today, over 80% of the income that families earn is through the market economy, not through the state employment system. And people are much more dependent on their success in the markets than on their dependence on patronage from the state.
Well, people don't know a great deal about North Korean citizens, so economically speaking, what's their life like there?
It's a very hard life. Most of them are in agriculture or in industries that are not supported by capital investment for decades. Pyongyang is a different story. It's an elite part of the country that they draw resources from the rural areas, and the standard of living of many people in Pyongyang has grown dramatically in the last 10 years or so.
Well, Kim Jong-un is, of course, portrayed in the media as a vicious dictator. So economically, is he doing a good job?
He's young and he's focused on the future, not so much on the past. And the future is one where he and his generation have expectations of a better life. And from the very beginning of his term of leadership, he's made it clear that he will give economic issues a high priority. And he has been saying publicly, both domestically and internationally, that he is going to improve the lives of ordinary people. And I think to some extent, he's tied the legitimacy of his leadership to his ability to deliver on economic improvement for the large majority of North Koreans.
Last month, China rejected a North Korean attempt to join its new Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank. Why was this, and what effect could this have on Pyongyang?
The story is that they asked whether they could become a founding member among other countries, and they said, well, you can't produce the information that we need, the statistical information about the economy, the condition of the finances of the country, to determine creditworthiness to borrow from international financial institutions. So they're not really able to produce the very minimum kind of information that it would take to be a viable member of an institution like that. Having said that, it's an interesting opportunity because the bank could provide a mechanism for North Korea to improve its own internal capacity. Reminds me of the way the European Union handled the arrival of new countries after the collapse of the Soviet Union when they wanted to join the EU. And the EU said, well, you can't join the club until you raise your systems, your labor laws, your financial system, your legal system up to a minimum standard that can be appropriate for membership. And that kind of incentive is possible for North Korea with the new Asian Infrastructure Investment Development Bank. And there could be a different dynamic of incentives for North Korea to make the internal reforms necessary to become increasingly more possibly engaged in the international financial system.
So North Korea didn't take this personally then?
Well, I think they realized that it's much more complicated than simply being able to join a new regional organization. But because it's regional and it's, has a governance framework that will be somewhat different than the World Bank and ADB and the IMF, there is an opportunity to engage them that is new.
China is, of course, a close neighbour to North Korea, and its economy has been seen to be slowing. What sort of effect will this have on North Korea?
Well, it could have a quite substantial effect. I mean, we're already seeing that commodity prices for example, in China have been declining, and that lowers the value of exports of minerals and coal to China. China is also imposing new restrictions on sulfur content of coal, address its own environmental problems, and that's also affecting North Korean exports because their coal has had unacceptable levels of sulfur, and that's affecting the trade relationship.
So finally, looking towards the future now, what's the major challenges to North Korea's economy, and can you see anything changing anytime soon?
Well, I think the biggest challenge is their willingness to adopt a more aggressive economic reform policy. They've tolerated the growth of markets because they've needed to accept that people have to find their own way in the current situation, but they've not really pursued a policy of really building the market economy and building the institutions, legal institutions, financial institutions that would support the growth of the market economy. And that's because they're afraid that if they do that the legitimacy of the old system will become more vulnerable, both domestically and in terms of international acceptance. Therefore, they're conflicted, and there is this internal conflict within North Korea, I think, is the biggest challenge that they face.